most people who are intellectually gifted, their brains really are truly wired differently. So there's less room because of all those neurons for the normal like pathways to, or not, well, typical. Like I said, I don't like the word normal. Typical pathways to establish themselves.
You're listening to the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast, just the thing we all said we needed when we first became parents. Remember that? Where's the handbook for this? I'm your host, Katie Kimball from Kids Cook Real Food, and I've brought together experts in the fields of health, parenting, nutrition, and more to help you, parents who truly want to raise healthy, independent kids, to get the information you need. Parenting is truly the toughest and most rewarding job in the world. Thank you for joining me to consult this Healthy Parenting Handbook, your guide to raising kids intentionally. Today, we're talking about a subset of kids that may be a pretty large subset that tends to make parenting feel even tougher. And it's a little more work to feel those rewards. My guest today and I get to talk all about neurodivergent kids and neurodivergent parenting and 2E kids. Catholic mom and author Ginny Kochis provides practical support and prayerful encouragement to Catholic families raising neurodivergent kids. But don't worry, regardless of your faith or lack thereof, this is going to be an excellent interview. Probably only about 7% do we dive into our shared Catholicism. After nearly 2 decades of parenting her own neurodivergent children, Ginny believes God gives curious, creative, intense children the exact mother they need to thrive. My friends, if you need to hear that today, this is definitely the interview for you. Hey, Ginny Kochis, thank you so much for being here. I'm happy to chat today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Now, I love reading everything you write because you have such humor and a little bit of just like a flat sarcasm, which is my favorite kind of humor. And you say that your whole family of 5 each have, quote, differently wired brains. Mm-hmm. And I just can't wait to talk about it. But first, what do you mean by differently wired?
So it's essentially the same as neurodivergent. You know, any kind of brain wiring that is different from what is considered typical. I don't like to use the word normal because normal is just a setting on the dryer, right? I mean, I consider differently wired brains to be people who are intellectually gifted, people who are twice exceptional, people who are, they have ADHD, have some sort of social, emotional, learning or developmental delay in some area. Differently wired just means that their brains are wired a little differently from what is typical.
The older I get and the more people I meet, the more I'm starting to wonder if there's like 2% or fewer of us who are typical.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variation. And I think for a long time, there was an expectation that everyone had to be cut from the same direct cloth. And pretty much for the past, I would say definitely when I was growing up, everyone was expected to fit that mold.
Right. One curriculum at school. This is how you teach math. This is how you learn to read, for sure.
Yes. And so anybody who deviated out of that was considered like weird or other. And you didn't want to be weird or other, So I'm glad now that people are just more aware, I think. And there's much more of an understanding about how the brain works just across the board.
Yeah. I just saw over the weekend someone who is a guest on someone else's podcast call himself neurodistinct. And I'm like,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we do over massage our terms. Right. We're a little too careful with our language. But I did kind of like that compared to neurodivergent and neurotypical. I kind of like neurodistinct. And so, Ginny, we are going to talk all about the positives and the reality. But I think it makes sense to start with the challenges because that's what parents kind of want to hear about. Like, what challenges do you experience in your family with all of this different wiring?
Well, executive function is hard. We're not organized people. So the house is typically, it's not filthy, it's just cluttered. There's creative minds at work. So there's always a lot of stuff everywhere. So there's that. There's also a lot of big emotions. So we do tend to have difficulty, especially when the kids were younger, with regulating emotions. So outbursts, meltdowns, and it happens, whether I used to homeschool and now my kids are in school. But it was something, we had to deal with at homeschool co-ops. When we were at church, we had to deal with it now that they're in the classroom. Each one of my kids has some sort of student assistance plan in place, whether it be an IEP or a 504. And it's hard for us, I think, as adults, for my husband and I, because we're aware that our brains don't always work the way perhaps we might want them to. So it's hard for us to, handle our own things, like my own anxiety, my own sort of tendency toward depression and melancholy, my own ADHD, right? To manage that and then keep the house going. So I think that's our challenges in a nutshell.
It all makes sense. And I do think, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I wonder how long did it take you just as a human to realize, oh, I don't actually think the same as everyone else? Because I feel like I'm starting to look around. The more we talk as a culture about brains and how they work and how people think, like I always thought that everybody thought like me. And then
Right,
I look
right.
around and I'm like, oh, people think differently, not just
Yeah.
about the opinions, but like people's brains work differently than mine. I thought I was just typical, normal,
Yeah. Yeah.
like what was your process of discovering that for yourself?
I think on some level, like internally, I knew that I was different growing up, because I always responded to things different from the kids that I was hanging around, and things would upset me more than they would upset them. And I took that as me being flawed somehow, and that I just always needed to correct that part of me. But it wasn't until really my oldest was diagnosed as she originally was diagnosed or identified as having Asperger's, but they don't use that anymore. It's now level 1 autism spectrum disorder, not impacting language or intelligence. It's a mouthful. But once she was diagnosed, and then she was diagnosed when she was like 5 or 6. And so then we had a 2-year-old. And then very shortly after, she began showing signs of extreme anxiety, which eventually developed into, she also has OCD. What else does she have? ADHD. Then once we had 3 of them who were all kind of a little different, I started to think, well, gosh, maybe I am too. Maybe all of this is just what I experienced. Like my kids are experiencing what I experienced growing up, and I just didn't realize what it was. I guess that would be the answer, is when I started doing more research on my children and what was going on with them, and trying to be the mom they needed me to be. I had to, arm myself with the knowledge, I think. And so, and that's when I realized what was going on with myself.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how many parents listening right now either are saying, yes, that's my
Yeah.
journey too. I didn't even understand my brain until I was an adult, or even thinking, I wonder if that's about to be my journey. You know what I mean? Like they're just thinking, perhaps I'm wired differently too.
Yeah. I mean, apples don't fall far from trees, to use the cliche. It does tend to be genetic. And I look back at my family history, my father, a lot of the things that I remember my mother getting frustrated with him about, like his piles of papers and, the fact that he was such a dreamer and he had all these different ideas, or even like my grandmother, she and her sisters, they were known as like the crazy women in their small town, so it makes sense. It is a genetic thing. I can understand why other women would suddenly be like, oh, you know what? I think that might be my case too.
Probably. And I already mentioned massaging language, but now you used a bunch of labels for your kids. But then think about how like the generation prior, your dad was a dreamer, or he was a piles person, or they were eccentric or eclectic. And it's so interesting to see that now we have more, say, official labels for the same thing. But there's positive and negative connotations that ultimately are attached to some of those, like a dreamer. To some people, maybe that's negative, but that also has a for sure, like a positive direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you can still be a dreamer and also have an actual diagnosis. I don't I don't refer to them usually as labels, because I think labels sometimes gets a bad rap. I like the term diagnosis because it's a tool, essentially. Once you have that tool, then you can figure out what you need to do to help either yourself or your child kind of thrive in a world that is not set up for those of us who aren't neurotypical.
Yeah, you know how to start your research.
Yeah.
When you have a term to use. And I know, Ginny, another term that you use is 2E, twice exceptional. And I feel like I'm probably not the only person out there who just really wants a clear explanation of like what that means and what it feels like day to day.
Yeah. So twice exceptional is when an individual is intellectually gifted and has a social, emotional, or developmental disability. So that would be, and it's actually very, very common, because most people who are intellectually gifted, their brains really are truly wired differently. So there's less room because of all those neurons for the normal like pathways to, or not, well, typical. Like I said, I don't like the word normal. Typical pathways to establish themselves. This would be, anybody who is, like I said, intellectually gifted and has ADHD, or like my oldest daughter. She is autism or autistic level 1. She is also intellectually gifted. Having, anxiety and being intellectually gifted, or having dyslexia and being intellectually gifted. I think there was a time when if you were gifted, you didn't struggle. You were just super smart and everybody expected you to be on top of everything and not have any problems at all. But if you look at some of the great minds in history, like even Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, so many of them really, truly struggled in school, like because their brains just were not set really or wired for that particular environment. And, what it often looks like. So, if you're wondering if maybe this is your child, one of the things you'll see a lot is asynchronous development. So when a child can do really amazing things like solve advanced math problems, is exceedingly articulate, can write very well, or is very, very verbal, but has meltdowns at the drop of a hat, can't tie their shoes. My youngest is 10. He still can't ride his bike. My oldest, she didn't ride her bike until she was 12. So there are a lot of things that seem like, gosh, they're so smart. Why can't they do X, Y, Z? Well, it's because they're twice exceptional.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it as it seems like it is kind of a combo deal. I mean, there's a reason that we always said the mad scientist.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Like even way back in the time of Albert Einstein and Thomas Edison, they, scientists sort of had this eclectic reputation, so to speak, or disorganized or whatever. And it totally makes sense that our brains only have room for so much.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, the brain is amazing and it continues to, develop and, make endless pathways. I mean, there's still stuff that we don't know about the human brain, but there comes a point where, there are parts of your brain that are excelling more than others. And with those who are twice exceptional, it's typically the intellect. And the other aspects like executive function, emotional regulation, those tend to, or even working memory, those tend to lag behind.
And I imagine, figuring out how to use your 2E, say, skills or 2E gifts as a superpower is just how to balance those out. And I've already gained some encouragement from what you've been talking about. But Ginny, what do you think moms of neurodivergent or neurodistinct and 2E kids, otherwise quirky kids, need to hear most of all?
Just that you're not alone, that there are other people out there like you, because it can be a very lonely vocation, especially when you see, other families out doing quote unquote normal things and not having to drag a child who is melting, having a sensory overload out of the building or out of the party, or, when you're getting phone calls home, with regularity, and they start with, so-and-so is so bright, but, you're not alone, and at the end of the day, I truly believe that, I am Christian, I'm Catholic. So I truly believe that God creates children the exact way he wants to create them, that there's nothing wrong with your child if your child is neurodivergent. It's simply how God was feeling that day and what he envisions for that little person that he's given to you, and that he gives those children to the exact right person that he knows will nurture and love them and care for them. And it's heavy, it can be hard. But it's also it's a beautiful thing. It's filled with grace, and it's definitely worth it.
It's important. We moms need to hear that. We really need to hear that. And so I just mentioned that, especially when you have the combo pact of maybe a higher intellect, but then the social or the emotional is struggling to catch up.
Sure.
We need to create an environment for our kids to thrive, right? As all parents do. So let's talk about like structure versus flexibility, because we want our quirky kids to strive. So what's the goal for harried parents who are like, I just need a system?
Yeah. I'm big on routine. So not necessarily structure, just like a rhythm to the day. Because without routine, there's a tendency to either hyper-focus on preferred topics or activities, or spin in circles because they don't know what to do next, and I even get like that. If I don't have a routine, I can spend probably 30 minutes like, well, what should I do? Should I do this? I don't know if I should, I need like a rhythm. But I think the great thing is that, I think some people look at structure as being this fixed structure, I guess, the fixed approach that can't change. If you have a routine, then you're bringing the best of both worlds. You've got the structure, that the kids kind of need to survive throughout their day, and they've got the flexibility that they also kind of need to be able to explore what their brains are hungering for at the moment. Like different rabbit holes they want to go down, especially I mentioned hyperfocus with ADHD, being able to spend hours and hours and hours researching a topic that they're interested in. Because I think a lot of people see ADHD as like being inattentive or not paying attention. But the thing about ADHD is you pay a whole lot of attention to the things that you're interested in and not a lot of attention to the other stuff. I think that's why it's good to have a blend of both, and having a routine provides that.
And so when you say routine, is it sort of, because a structure would be you do exactly this, and this
right.
in this order. It's like a checklist. Mm-hmm. Is a routine more like sort of buckets of time in which there's some choice?
Yeah, it's just fluid. For us, it's a little different than it was when we were homeschooling. Mm-hmm. When we were homeschooling, it was in the morning, we would have breakfast, and then we'd kind of sit and talk and do like, morning basket type stuff. And then we'd probably try to get some physical activity in, maybe a walk, maybe throw a ball around outside, do some chalk on the sidewalk. And then we'd come inside and do, I would give them a choice like, hey, do we want to do science or do we want to do English, or reading or whatever? And they would get to choose. And each child would get to choose what they wanted to do. And then we'd work for a little bit. And then when people got restless, we'd, get up and do something else, probably, another activity, something physical movement, and then lunch, so it was just kind of like the day flowed. And by the end of the day, I was sort of able to make sure that we'd checked everything off. Now that the kids are in school, it's more of a rhythm of what do we do when we get up? We are sort of bound to a schedule, I guess, because I have to have them out the door at a certain time. But there's still a fluidity to it. And my girls are 17 and 14. So they are pretty much self-sufficient with that. Although I do, my 14-year-old does have some issues with time blindness, which is really common in ADHD. So she does need a lot of reminders. But then when we, in the afternoon when we get home, it's a lot of decompressing from the day, and then eventually moving into homework. I think it's just sort of moving in whatever rhythm works for your family and not necessarily freaking out if XYZ isn't done by 9:00.
I was going to say that I noticed you had 0 times that, neither a number of minutes nor a time of day. And I think that's a really important facet, right, to a routine versus a structure. I know I used to teach 3rd grade and I would say, at 9:10, we're doing this. And I'd stress myself out so much because by 9:35, we were not moving on because we were jamming in whatever we were doing at 9:10. I've also never heard the term time blindness, but that 5,000% applies to me.
Yeah.
I have no idea ever how long things will take or are taking. Yeah. So that's interesting. And again, like moms out there, like it's okay if you're saying, wow, that's me too. Yeah. Because you figured out and we continue to sort of hack our lives. Yeah. What I noticed about your homeschool schedule is you were very much in and out of activity, stationary. And I think I'm sure that was a really helpful thing, for your kids.
Yeah, it helps. Movement helps with helping kids regulate. So, I can tell when people are getting fidgety. I can tell when I'm getting fidgety, So yeah, it was better. It was better for everybody if we had some of that sprinkled in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm a huge proponent of teaching kids to cook, which is moving, but also takes some focus. And we talk about life skills. So when it comes to household tasks, with your 2E or your ND kids or whatever we want to, I know I'm like, I don't want to label them with your quirky kids.
Yeah.
What do you do? Like, what's your routine for that? Are there pitfalls to watch out for other moms and dads to look out for? Are there any particular silver linings that come with the gift of 2E?
Yeah, the silver linings are, they're always finding out of the box solutions for things, the creative ways of looking at problems and just the joy that it brings. Like when a kid makes something, like my son, he could take a cardboard box, cut it up and make a mini golf course out of it with a glue gun, so it's those kinds of things. Like he's destroying my house, but he's creating. So that's what I'm fine with it. I think a lot of the pitfalls are the executive function piece and the working memory. So like with my oldest, I would say, okay, it's time to go get dressed when she was around like 9-10. She would go upstairs, but then she would disappear and not come back down. And I would go up there and she'd be still in her pajamas with her nose in a book, So I learned very early on that kids need specific tasks laid out for them, and lots of checklists, lots of visual reminders, lots of schedules. Even putting up a picture of the way the dishwasher is supposed to be loaded, like right next to the dishwasher, having that visual reminder of what that looks like is hugely important. Posting on the back of the door the steps for cleaning the bathroom, because it's very hard, especially if you struggle with working memory, to remember, okay, I do this and then this and then this. So like the steps are difficult. But if you have those steps laid out and all you have to do is check them off, it's easy.
That makes sense. And I can feel a bit of that. And I have a feeling that a lot of moms do, where like you're working in the kitchen or you're doing something and then you just sort of stand there and go, ugh, what do I have to do next?
Right.
It can really, really stop the forward momentum. So for our kids, especially with less fully formed brains, in general than adults, those task lists, these are so practical, Ginny. I just feel like people are like taking notes and like, yes, this is a great after school routine, mental note. My kids probably maybe couldn't do homework right away when they get off the bus. And it's, super, super helpful. Do your kids get in the kitchen? Do they cook with you at all?
My older two do. It depends on if I invite them. We do have a lot of selective palates. My 17-year-old, she's gotten much better. But when she was younger, right around the time she was diagnosed, she had 5 foods that she would eat. And there was no going around that. We did feeding therapy. We did all the things that you were supposed to do. She now has a wider variety of foods that she will eat. But she still, struggles to be like super adventurous. Like still at Thanksgiving, she probably will eat plain turkey and a roll, which is, fine. Because my attitude is they are responsible for getting their nutrition. I'm responsible for providing the food. So I try to make sure that I provide lots of healthy options and then they get to choose. But the other day, actually, I was running late and I texted both of my girls in a panic. And I was like, here are the things that need to be done to get dinner moving. Please do these things. And when I walked in, my 17-year-old was rolling out the pizza dough and my 14-year-old was standing at the stove sauteing the onions and the green pepper had been chopped, and I was very, very, very pleased to see that. So they do help me in the kitchen. Probably not as often, although my 14-year-old will go in the kitchen and make her own stuff because she likes to cook. So it's
such a nice feeling when you walk in the kitchen and like, A, they did something you asked them to do. B, it's super helpful. C, they're like skilled and you just go, it worked today.
Right.
This worked today. And by the way, you're saying they might not get in the kitchen as much. Well, as much as your average American kid, I can guarantee you if they've chopped a green pepper and sauteed an onion, they're in the kitchen more than the average. So just, pat yourself on the back there. And I did want to talk about picky eating too, which you did a little bit, because I know statistically kids on the spectrum are more likely to be picky eaters, more likely to have a closed down palate. And so I think it does go hand in hand a little bit with neurodivergence. You talked about your oldest. What has been your strategy or your experience with having a positive dinner table?
Well, I mentioned division of responsibility. So the idea that it's my responsibility to provide the food and it's their responsibility to eat it. So I try to put things on the table that I know that everybody will eat and then let them choose, because I think, especially when they're younger and still just sort of feeling out what autism feels like for them, like being autistic in the world, that's like the one thing they have control over, is what they put in their mouths. So, and, things like textures, smells. Like I asked my daughter once, there was some kind of food I asked her about. I think it might've been rice cakes. I'm not sure. But I asked her, like, why, you like popcorn. Why don't you like rice cakes? And she was like, because rice cakes feel like eating stabby styrofoam, like the way she was so viscerally able to describe what it was like for her. It's kind of like how some people think cilantro tastes like soap. You've got those just aspects of experiencing a food in a completely different way from the typical experience. I think that is, a big piece of it. So I try very hard to make sure that I have something for everyone and that I don't put pressure on the kids for what they want to eat. They're always welcome to get up in the kitchen and go make a sandwich. For my oldest, it's almond butter and honey. For my youngest, it's peanut butter. Eventually, my oldest, she started, I think part of it was social, part of it was her palate just maturing over time. She started branching out. She went out with her friends for homecoming and had a pork chop, and did great at a restaurant. So yeah, I just don't stress. I can't. When my oldest was younger, we had so many nights at the table where there was screaming and crying, and it was awful, and I didn't want her to not eat. So I just backed off. And then eventually it all worked itself out.
You really went through the gauntlet
We did.
of the bad experiences, and through that, I think, bounced to a really good place, because you're right.
Fortunately,
we can't respectfully force our kids to eat.
No. Mm-mm.
I'm really glad you thought of the rice cake example too, because it's very difficult for kids especially, but for adults too, to think outside of our brains through someone else's eyes.
Sure, exactly.
And wonder, how they're experiencing the world. I hear a lot of parents say, and I've said it too, like, I don't get it. My kid will eat spaghetti with sauce. Why won't they eat pizza with sauce, or vice versa?
Right. Totally different texture.
It's the same thing, but it's not.
Yeah, it's not. It's very much not the same.
Yeah. I know my kids have, I think it's my daughter has said, what if everything tastes different to every single person? Just slightly. Like, I'll never know what this dish tastes like to you, Mom.
Right.
Because you can't possibly explain it so that I can experience it. And I'm like, that's really profound. And it could be a little true.
Yeah.
And when you think of that cilantro example too, which really relates well to something that you talk a lot about, and I'm sure your community benefits from these reminders, and that's the growth mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Tell us more about this, maybe like steps 1 and 2 for parents who have never thought about building a growth mindset in their kids before.
Yeah. So the thing about growth mindset is learning to see challenges and struggles as a stepping stone. So it's not necessarily that once you face a difficulty, it's over. It's an opportunity to learn and to develop and to move forward. So that's what growth mindset is using a challenge as a stepping stone. Helping kids learn to reframe how they see themselves and how they see the world around them. So like, it's very simple to say, like, instead of I can't do this, I don't know how to do this yet. I'm still learning. I'm still working on it. So there are a lot of other ways to reframe it. I don't know how to do this. I'm going to learn how to do this. Reframing it in a way that is positive, so that instead of saying I failed, say I struggled, but I'm going to figure this out. And I think that's like just the basic ground level. But then, of course, you can work into it also like the virtues of patience and perseverance, and, the idea that suffering isn't meaningless, that, there's a reason for it. We go through it and it refines us and makes us stronger. So yeah, I think once mastering the basics of just reframing how you think is huge. And then you can go from there.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you're kind of dipping our toes into our mutual Catholicism, because there aren't, I don't know, maybe there are. It doesn't feel like there are very many paths of faith that really talk about the value in suffering, and that suffering isn't meaningless, that it has such deep value. For sure, the world is saying to our children, they're made for comfort, they're made for mediocrity.
Right.
But, I know you believe that your kids are made for greatness. So how do we get our kids to own that?
Yeah, it's hard. And I think what you really have to do is, you focus on the crucifixion, the idea that, but you have to be careful, because then if you have kids who are really anxious, they can't so much handle this until they're older.
Right.
But, Christ suffered a lot, but he did it willingly, because he knew that something greater was going to come out of that. And sometimes I talk about, how with my kids, how childbirth was not easy. Childbirth is not my favorite thing, but I got my favorite things from that experience, from going through that. So, giving them examples, I think I use, the stories of the saints a lot, helping them see that there are these great people, these great holy individuals who through time, or, over time, worked through the massive struggles and setbacks, and persevered and came out the other side with something mighty and wonderful. And also, if saints aren't your thing, looking at public figures, people who, like Helen Keller. Temple Grandin is another one. She's an autistic woman who is she's a college professor. She is an agricultural engineer. So yeah, I think it's good to give them concrete examples that they can follow. And then setting an example ourselves, saying that, like, because I used to find myself saying, I am just no good at this. But the truth is that I probably could get better if I practiced, showing the kids that, hey, I really did not throw that ball very well, but I'm going to try again. Teach me, what do I need to do? But I think all of that goes into the power of redemptive suffering, the idea that, when we suffer, we are made stronger and we come closer to Christ in those sufferings that we're experiencing. And it brings us closer to where he wants us to be and what he wants us to become.
And this is not a 1 day or 1 hour lesson.
No.
It's not a talk. It's got to be by our example, by our humility, by our getting up and trying again. Like, it's hard to root out some of that language.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Of I can't do this, or man, I stink at this, or this stinks, or, all sorts of stuff that we say as adults. So kids do make us better people, for sure.
They do.
For sure. Do you have any kids who push back on that and who tell you that it sounds dumb to add yet and they don't want your advice?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think so. Like, I think kids are like that in general, but I do find mostly that I think kids are hungry for a way to succeed. Kids want to thrive. They want to become the people that God has put on their heart. My children, I can't get my girls to read my books. My girls haven't read my growth mindset journal, and really my son hasn't either. But it's fine, because we still so I guess in that way, sure, they resist. I mean, they also I have a novel, they haven't read it. It's fine. I don't mind as long as we're still having the dialogue at home. That's what matters the most to me.
And you're setting their voice in their head for 10 and 20 years from now. You're setting their habits.
Sure.
And so it's sinking in whether they speak it now or not. But I have parents tell me all the time, like, oh, I want your help, Katie, in teaching my kids to cook, because they don't want to hear one more thing from me. They don't want to even hear the things I'm currently telling them, which echoes that we've got to surround ourselves with good people, right? We've got to surround ourselves with friends and family members who are encouraging and edifying, and the stories of the saints. It must have been you who had a list of saints with mental illness.
I do. I have a list of 100 patron saints for neurodivergent kids. So it covers, everything from mental health concerns to, saints who were probably ADHD, saints who were probably on the spectrum, saints who are creative thinkers. It just covers, it runs the gamut. So because I think that's really important, is having, being able to identify also, because that population is more likely statistically to walk away from faith. So, having someone who is like you, who has embraced faith and walked that path, I think is really helpful and encouraging.
I have not heard that statistically, that kids on the spectrum or neurodivergent 2E are more likely to lose their faith.
And even those who are gifted, just straight intellectually gifted, because there's a strong, the phrase I'm thinking is not appropriate, but a strong, they don't like hypocrisy. So if you're saying one thing and you're doing something else, they will call you on it and they will want to have nothing to do with you. And also having things, black and white, a lot of really black and white thinking. So that can be a struggle. Trying to understand things that are abstract instead of concrete can be difficult. Wanting a sense of belonging. But if you look at intellectuals, some of the greatest intellectuals of our modern contemporary time, they are not people of faith. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson, he really has no faith, and he's open about that. So, but I think it's important to help kids see that, for thousands of years, the Catholic Church was in the forefront of scientific discovery. Georges Lemaitre was the priest who established the Big Bang Theory. There was I can't remember her name right now, but a sister who, there's so many.
Sure. Well, and even just C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and their contemporaries were highly intellectual.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's common, and it weighs on me a lot, especially with my oldest, because I want her to embrace her faith, but faith for her is different than it looks for me. Her faith is very logical and straightforward. Mine is more, like a feelings based faith. And she would often come to me and say, I'm not as religious as you are. I'm like, what are you talking about? It doesn't have to look the same for every person. Faith and your relationship with God is a very personal thing. And he loved you. He created you exactly the way you are. And he wants you to come to him the way that you are. That was a long, drawn-out explanation. Sorry.
No, but beautiful to have these examples. And outside of the world of faith, I think a quick Google search would come up with with highly esteemed people in history with neurodivergence. I
Yeah,
know I worked with a speaker with bipolar, and he listed quite a number of heavy hitters
sure.
who were, considered to potentially, like, we don't know, right? We don't know if Abe Lincoln had bipolar, but people suspect it. People suspect Martin Luther King Jr. had bipolar.
I mean, if you look in history, there's a lot of us, who have done really fantastic, amazingly wonderful things that we probably wouldn't have done if we didn't have these extra things. I don't know that I really like calling them superpowers, but I do think it's a different way of looking at the world and thinking outside the box.
And if everyone thought the same, life would be very boring. We
Absolutely.
would not have figured out, how to solve very many of the world's problems. And we've got a lot more problems in the world. So we need creative people to keep being raised up here. You have a little creative endeavor that I think is so fun. Like I mentioned, you use humor, you use creativity in your mom community online. And, but you also write fiction, which,
I do.
hundreds of thousands of people say they want to write books and hardly anyone does it. So you manage to corral your own executive function and your creativity and get it done. Tell us a little about that book.
Well, that was all my ADHD hyperfocus. That wasn't really. I just ignored everything else. So, but yeah, it's called Blink and We'll Miss It. It's a young adult novel. It's a coming of age novel. There's a sweet little romance line that runs through it. A little bit of magical realism, but it's a story of a 17-year-old May whose mother has mental illness. She is bipolar, but she's an artist, and she has really struggled most of her life with sustaining treatment for her bipolar disorder and also maintaining her life as an artist. So May has spent most of her childhood kind of raising her mother, and it's caused her to kind of push people away. So the book is all about, finding forgiveness, being able to forgive yourself, being able to forgive the people that have hurt you, being able to forgive your parents for maybe even things they didn't even have control over. It's about family. It's about reconstructing those bonds that have been broken and lost, especially between a mother and a daughter. That was really important to me, to have that, have their connection and their relationship restored. It's about, opening yourself up and being vulnerable, opening yourself up to love, letting other people love you. Especially for May, she had a hard time with that, or she does in the book, and learning to love herself because, part of the magical realism, there's this thing that happens to her called a blink, or that's what she calls them, where she is transported into the past and she's able to see like scenes from her family history. So there's, some deep-seated family secrets that she ends up uncovering. But, because her mother is bipolar, she begins to wonder, oh my gosh, am I hallucinating? Am I going crazy? So, throughout the novel, she has to work through these feelings about herself. She has to be open to, letting this blink happen to her so that she can help kind of heal the brokenness of her family because it goes back generations. No, it was a labor of love. It was based on, I kind of drew on my grandmother and her sisters and their own experiences. It's set in the small town where my grandmother grew up. So yeah, and then I'm working on the prequel, so the story of May's mom right now. So it's been a joy.
I was going to ask if you had any future plans for May, but you have past plans for May, which fits the book pretty well.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, that's awesome. And you've woven such a beautiful tapestry of the mental illness and the family. And I know that it's clean for young adults. So thank you for that. It's on my daughter. She doesn't know it's on her Christmas list, but she's getting it for Christmas, my high school daughter. And I think it's actually perfect for our whole discussion because when I was a kid, we were taught there were genres: historical fiction, realistic fiction, science fiction, right? Yes. And you just said this is basically 99% realistic fiction with this one little bit of magical realism. And how fun is it that we can just like push the boundaries? We can just nick the walls of those categories, just like our kids do.
Absolutely.
When they're a little bit outside of, quote, the norm or the typical. So that's such a beautiful analogy. This has been incredible, Ginny. And I love to leave parents with a message of hope and a feeling of positivity. So if you could encourage parents in one way, whether that's with a story or just some words of encouragement, what do you want people to remember as we, hit off on this podcast?
Yeah, it's just one step at a time. It feels like you have to run a mountain or run, a marathon in a minute, and you don't. It's the growth that will happen in your family and even in yourself. It takes time, and it's not going to be a steady upward trajectory. You're going to have highs and lows, and that's okay. We just do the next right thing. We take the next right step. And we trust that God will be there to catch us when we stumble.
Thank you for that. And where do you want people to look for you online? Obviously, look up Blink and We'll Miss It if you're into the fiction. On the web, where should we look?
Well, my author website is ginnykochis.com, super simple. And then all of my neurodivergent stuff is at quirkycatholickids.com.
Very cool. And we'll make sure to link to all of that anywhere we share this interview. Thank you so much, Ginny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Healthy Parenting Handbook podcast. I hope your brain feels fed and your heart feels full and that you feel connected, knowing that there are other parents on this journey with you. We're just trying to raise healthy, independent adults. And the next time you think, man, there is no handbook for this job. Now there is the Healthy Parenting Handbook. Look up the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please leave a review, my friends, as that helps other parents who need this information to find us. And of course, subscribe. That's a huge help. You can also look for our shorts as a reel on Instagram at Katie Kimball Kids Cook, or subscribe to the Healthy Parenting Handbook Shorts channel on YouTube. You'll get those bite-sized portions of healthy parenting advice.